We're far enough into the season where we've watched enough football games, and specifically football games about the Cleveland Browns or broadcast about the Cleveland Browns, that we all have pet peeves that we have while watching this game that are created because of how the NFL decides to broadcast these games and how the play-by-play commentators decide to cover the game. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about our pet peeves, about how the Browns get covered during the games. But before that, let me thank my sponsor for today's video, DraftKings. You guys know what time it is. It's starting to get a little chilly, right? You're starting to feel that cold. You might have to go grab a jacket. Might have to go grab your favorite pair of boots just to get them broken in before the winter really starts going. And in addition to that, it's football every weekend. And that's what the fall is all about. You can make each weekend, by the way, even more exciting by getting into the action with my partners at DraftKings, the number one place to bet on touchdowns. And right now, all new customers who bet $5 will instantly get $200 in bonus bets. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and sign up using my promo code WORSTTAKE. The crown is yours. This $200 in bonus bets instantly. Stay in on the action and use your $200 in bonus bets to bet on anytime touchdowns on DraftKings. DraftKings is the best place to bet touchdowns. If sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't worry. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Daily Fantasy and have a shot to win cash prizes. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use my promo code WORSTTAKE and bet just $5 on any wager and get $200 in bonus bets instantly. That's promo code WORSTTAKE only at DraftKings Sportsbook. So we all have pet peeves while watching the game. And look, I'm not going to go at the more broad pet peeves that people have during games, right? You might have a beef with a specific commentator, or you might have a beef with how specific commentators talk about certain concepts that every team runs. I'm not really talking about the things that can apply to all 32 teams. I'm really just talking about Brown specific pet peeves that pop up in these broadcasts that I really wish would end. So make this my note to NFL game day producers. Please keep this out of the game day script, because I think Browns fans have had enough of it, especially people who watch these broadcasts. I just don't see what value these things bring. So first thing is the damn doom scroll. Every time the Cleveland Browns play a game with even a semi-national audience, whoever is producing the script for the broadcast cannot help themselves from doing the doom scroll. If the Browns play on ESPN, you're going to see the doom scroll. If the Browns play on CBS at 4 o'clock, you're going to see the doom scroll. If the Browns have the number 2 commentary on CBS at 1 o'clock, you're going to see the damn doom scroll. It doesn't, if it's more than just the team that the Browns are playing's market and the Browns market playing, we're going to see the doom scroll. It's like every single company has come together and said, hey, when the Browns play in front of a national audience, we got to show the doom scroll. Now, some of you might be asking, Quincy, what are you talking about? What's the doom scroll? You all know what it is. It pops up every time. But the doom scroll is where the broadcast goes over every single failure that the Cleveland Browns have had as an organization since like the 80s. So they'll talk about, not even the 80s, the 70s. They'll go back to Red Right 88. They will talk about the drive and then the fumble and then the team getting moved. And they'll remind you that we had Bill Belichick and then he got fired by Art Modell, not the Cleveland Browns, but Art Modell and the Baltimore Browns, technically, at that point. And then how the team came back and how bad their record was for the first 18 years that they came back. And then they'll remind you that they lost in the playoffs at one time in 2002 after they had a lead. And then, you know, it's just been quarterbacks after quarterbacks after quarterbacks after quarterbacks after quarter. They show you the damn jersey that even the people who created it don't want to talk about anymore. And then on top of all of that, they'll show you the 0-16. They'll give you a picture of Hugh Jackson there or some kind of animation of it. And that's the doom scroll. It's basically reminding you of everything this organization has ever done wrong. There was a point in time where the doom scroll made sense to put on the broadcast when the Browns are out there, right? Because it did provide context to why the Cleveland Browns were as bad as they were. When they were an awful team, the doom scroll made sense because you did need to tell people that the Browns are bad and why they're bad. And this would make people sympathetic when they would watch the Browns nationally. And this would make people root for the Browns. A lot of people who are Browns fans to this day are probably Browns fans because they saw the doom scroll and then looked down and saw that record and was like, man, I want them to be better. Right. The Browns had a lot of that kind of sympathy going on before they hired Kevin Stefanski and actually started winning games, as opposed to losing most of the games that they play. So I get why the doom scroll is there. And yes, it is history that is there. I'm not saying we should erase the history of what happened to this team and act like those bad things never existed and burn the history, but I'm not suggesting that. But we really aren't at the point anymore where we need to put that in the broadcast. And I think it sends a misleading image of the team at this point to include it as the broadcast. You know what it feels like when they go to this doom scroll? It's like when you've made a mistake when you were like in the adolescence, like super young, and like people you grew up with or your family or your parents like refuse to let that go despite the fact that you have moved on from your adolescence a very long time ago. That's what this feels like. It's like, hey man, remember that time you did that thing? And it's like, dog, that the people in charge aren't the same. We've had different people in charge for almost half a decade. Like the circumstances that created a lot of those stats that you bring up just don't exist anymore. And instead of talking about the circumstance that the Browns currently exist in, we're hyper focused on what happened in an era that has ended for the Cleveland Browns. And when I say an era has ended, I don't mean that the Browns have like flipped the book and become this Super Bowl contender, but they're clearly a much more competitive franchise in the 4 years that Kevin Stefanski has been here than they were the 20 years that happened prior to his arrival post reactivation of the franchise in 1999. That part is clear. That doesn't mean that there's not stuff to criticize about this era of the Cleveland Browns, but it would just be nice if the broadcast could focus on that. Like, what is this era of the Cleveland Browns good at? What is the story of this era of the Cleveland Browns in the division? What is the story of this Kevin Stefanski era of when it comes to trades and all that? But instead, we end up talking about everything else the Browns have done. And for the most part, it's just not relevant what the Cleveland Browns were doing before 2020 or 2018 when discussing the Browns in 2024, because this Browns team is largely removed from that history. Like, maybe you can go back as far as 2018, but a lot of the stuff that went on in 2014 just is not happening at the same level or even at similar levels with the Cleveland Browns currently. And that's why I think when you put the doom scroll there, it's not just annoying because you're reminding me of all the times the Browns have broken my heart. Like, that's definitely playing a factor in why I hate it. But also, I don't think it paints a good picture to somebody who might not be a Browns fan that's choosing to watch this game of what's actually going on in this game. Think about the division splits and how they've changed since Kevin Stefanski arrived versus what they were before 2020. If you go by the overall splits, you're going to think the Browns have no chance to win division games. But Kevin Stefanski has a good division record. That doesn't get talked about enough, and that doesn't get brought up in these broadcasts enough. And I hope that they change that so that when we watch a game in 2024, it feels like the broadcast was also made knowing what's going on with the team in 2024. It's not all great, but I just wish that those numbers were more represented than stuff that happened in 2016 and 2017 and 1980. Like, it just feels weird. All I'm saying is you should be critical on the broadcast and praising the Browns for the things that they have done in this era. If you want to bring up the Deshaun Watson contract and the Deshaun Watson trade, I think that's all fair because the people who are responsible for that are on the team right now in charge, still making decisions. And that context is important because Deshaun Watson's still here as well. And I think as long as, Kevin Stefanski and Andrew Berry are here, that's fair game to bring up. But why are we talking about 0-16 in 2024 in a broadcast in a 2024 game when none of the 0-16 is here anymore? Why are we talking about the drive, the fumble, the team moving? Yes, I get it. It paints a picture that Browns fans have been through a lot and they have stuck through this team throughout a lot, but I don't think that point needs to be explained as thoroughly to people anymore. And two, there's other ways to explain that point other than like spending 5 minutes on the broadcast reminding every Browns fan of every bit of trauma this team's ever put them through when the people in charge or the people who own the team and create the circumstances for all of that aren't here anymore. Browns have made the playoffs 2 times in the last 4 years, which is a higher rate than most teams. Most teams in a span of 4 years don't make the playoffs 50% of the time. The Browns have been able to win 11 games 2 times in the last 4 years, again, higher than a rate than most teams are able to get to 11 wins in a span of 4 years. The Browns aren't in the spectacularly bad category of football team anymore. You can argue where they land above that, right? I would say that they land in a pretty good to above average tier right now until they have some more playoff success. Then they could get into the great tier or the contender tier, but they need that playoff success. But still, they are clearly not in that tier anymore. And when the Browns aren't in that tier and you put the doom scroll out, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. I think it's laziness, to be honest with you, because people are used to putting the doom scroll in the script for the broadcast whenever the Cleveland Browns play. And they just haven't taken it out of the broadcast because they haven't really thought about if that makes sense to have in there. But like, even this extends to how certain things get framed about the Browns. Every single team, if you dig into splits deep enough, they have a crazy split that exists there somewhere in the negative, but it feels like there is a fetish from the national media whenever the Browns play to find like the craziest splits that you can find that don't really even mean anything. Like, you'll watch a Browns game and they'll tell you, since coming back in 1999, the Browns haven't won a road game when the weather is 66 degrees and it snows at the same time ever. And it's like, okay, why are we bringing up that split? Like, they would just pull these splits out of thin air and then like portray it as something that should be negative on the Cleveland Browns. And I think that kind of leads to the whole thing. I don't think these broadcasts, the way that they frame these broadcasts and the way that they decide to kind of fill in the blanks with these broadcasts, especially nationally, have caught up to the fact that the Browns are a team now that has a coach and GM in their second term, that has not been going through constant turmoil and deserves to be judged on the broadcast based on what the people in charge have done. When the Browns were churning through coaches and GMs every 2 years, you didn't have anything or a big enough database or a big enough sample of those coaches to really have any real stats and trends to pull from that would be relevant for the audience. So I get why the doom scroll was there, but you got 4 years going on 5 years of Kevin Stefanski stats to go off of. And that should really be how you do it. And if you look at how the Pittsburgh Steelers are covered, if you look at how the Ravens are covered, even the Cincinnati Bengals are covered, they're covered not from what they have done in total, but what they have done in the current era that they exist in. So when you see Steelers splits and Steelers stats on a ESPN broadcast, they talk about the stuff that's happened exclusively during the Tomlin era, or they talk about stuff with Baltimore, about stats and stuff that exists exclusively during the Harbaugh era. And the same thing would be true for the Bengals during the Joe Burrow era, right? Like, they have these distinctive eras. that they pull these stats from. And it makes no sense that when the Cleveland Browns are on national TV, instead of pulling these stats to fill the broadcast about the Kevin Stefanski era, which has existed since 2020, just as long as the Joe Burrow era has existed, even longer, because Joe Burrow's era really didn't start till 2021. Instead of doing that, we're pulling stats from the 1980s and what the Browns have done since 99. And I feel like that's not useful for anybody. I don't think that creates a compelling broadcast for anybody watching in Cleveland. I don't think that adds useful context for anybody nationally. And I don't think that adds useful context for anybody watching opposed to the Cleveland Browns, right? I think it would be better if they just judged the Browns not based off of the overall history, but just in the era that they are in. Again, not saying that we don't ever talk about the bad history the Cleveland Browns have had or the history of bad luck that the Cleveland Browns have had, but pull it up when it's relevant, right? If the Browns get to a conference championship game, then it makes perfect sense to talk about the drive or the fumble. If the Browns, have a spectacular run during the season, it's important to contrast that with, hey, look what they used to do and look at where they came from. But it feels like the doom scroll only gets brought up simply to make Browns fans and make people feel bad for Browns fans. Like, it just seems like that's the only reason for the existence of the doom scroll. It doesn't serve a narrative purpose during the game. It's just something that they have ready, that they've been using for years, that they just continue to want to throw out there in the broadcast because they don't want to think of anything else. And I think the broadcast gets worse because of the doom scroll. So if you are a producer, there is my argument. It's not just because I'm a Browns fan and I don't like hearing the negative. I talk about the negative with the Browns all the time. It's because I just don't think it's productive for the broadcast to talk about an era that is over with when you're talking about a current Browns broadcast. It doesn't make much sense to me. And here's what I mean by it doesn't make the broadcast better. Because when the Browns play the Steelers, what broadcasts usually fall back on is talking about how dominant the Steelers have been overall in the rivalry. And specifically, they focus on the dominance that existed during the Big Ben era during this Browns-Steelers rivalry. And yeah, that stuff deserves to be talked about when we're talking about Big Ben, or we want to make a point about where the rivalry is historically, but the rivalry in the game that we're talking about exists in the context of this era going on right now with both teams. And the fact is, Big Ben is not the quarterback for Pittsburgh anymore, and the Browns are in a different era with Kevin Stefanski. And in the Stefanski era, the rivalry with the Cleveland Browns and the Pittsburgh Steelers has been significantly closer. Both teams have only won one game on the road in this rivalry since the Kevin Stefanski era started in 2020. The Browns one time in a wild card game versus the Pittsburgh Steelers in a upset victory in Heinz Field, and the Pittsburgh Steelers one time, I think in 2021 versus the Cleveland Browns at home, they were able to win. But outside of those two games, the home team has been dominant. And if you're watching this game in this context, in this era, during the Kevin Stefanski era, outside of the Big Ben era for the Pittsburgh Steelers, what stat actually is more helpful to tell you what kind of game it's going to be? The stat that tells you what Big Ben used to do to the Browns, or the stat that tells you what the rivalry has been like during the last 4 years? But we keep bringing up the doom scroll, and it just sends a misleading image that every time the Browns beat the Steelers, it's an upset. The Browns beat the Steelers at home, it's not an upset. It's what's been expected in the recent history of this rivalry, and this goes on to when the Browns play the Ravens. They keep going back to stats that existed before 2020 and splits that existed before 2020. They don't really focus on what the Browns have done in division during the Stefanski era. And again, it sends this image that the Browns are this team that have struggled in this division the last 4 years, but it's not true. The Browns have been pretty good in division. Kevin Stefanski's division record is actually really strong. You don't see these splits because they use that time to talk about the drive that happened in 88 or the team moving in 95, and I just don't think it's relevant enough anymore to bring up, and there's just more important splits and stats to get to when you're covering the Cleveland Browns, especially for a national audience that might not know where the Cleveland Browns are at. that would make more sense to put in the broadcast than just letting people know about all the shit that they already know, because every national broadcast of the Cleveland Browns has let people know, yeah, the Browns have been through stuff. Like, we get it at this point. The doom scroll doesn't make much of a sense. And again, if you're a producer for NFL broadcast, please resist the urge to put that on there. There are better things. You can make a better broadcast by saying no to the doom scroll. I promise you, there's a better way to look at it.